Oh yeah, what's up G's? Welcome back to the Shanghai Pete broadcast. It is a crisp fall evening here in the City of Angels and we are live and alive. Hope you've all had a fun/functional week and escaped work without too much damage. We have got a hefty one to get into tonight. So where do we go? Inside. And how far do we go? Deep. Just a quick personal note before we get into it today. I want to give a quick shout out to community member Jokes on You. He's been a supporter of the channel and everything we do here for years, since back when we had like 200 subs, and he is an absolute G. He's going through some stuff right now, and I just want to let him know we're all thinking of him and his family and hope everything works out. He's usually in the comments, so if you happen to see him, maybe drop a note or say what's up. Our community here might not be super big, but we do think it's important to support all our Gs when they're going through stuff. So much love from all of us here at the channel, Brosy. Hope you're feeling better. Today, friends, we have sort of a dual purpose video. It's equal parts I told you so and a tough talk. Well, probably not equal parts. It's mostly a tough talk video, but because I'm somewhat of an insufferable egomaniac, it's also a little bit of an I told you so video. That's right. Today is the day we get deep inside the Final Fantasy problem. If your response to that phrase is, what Final Fantasy problem? Congrats on not being irrecoverably obsessed with the franchise. But if your response is, screw you, idiot, there's no problem with Final Fantasy, everything Square Enix does is awesome, then sadly this video is likely not for you, and you can safely return to pre-ordering everything with the name Final Fantasy attached to it, or looking at your $200 plastic sword clock, whatever it is y'all do. For the rest of you though, it is indeed time for another tough talk. Geez, there is something wrong with Final Fantasy. It's hard to put your finger on, but I think we can all feel it. Maybe you started noticing after 10, maybe after 12. Maybe it wasn't until you tried to unravel the obtuse misery that was the narrative in 13 that it really hit you. Whenever it was, I think we all know it. My friends that aren't even into RPGs like that know it. It kind of seems like Final Fantasy is dying. It's on its way out. It's heading home. The Grim Reaper memes are popping up. The subreddits are burning themselves down. The streetlights just turned on and you can hear its mom yelling from the neighbor's house. In short, it is not looking good. So, why do I say that? Why do you feel that? The simplest explanation, though there's far more to it than this, of course, is that it's the same reason we'd say any franchise or product is dying in a market completely and utterly controlled by profit margins. It's not making enough money. That's rather self-evident to me, likely for you as well, but for the sake of being thorough, let's use what some of us like to call facts to support that conclusion. The primary and most important fact being what we just stated, courtesy of the disaster capitalism hellscape we're all currently barely managing to live through, is that it's not making enough money. And also, people don't really seem to like it anymore. Side note on modern business practices here, we all of course have very different ideas about what enough money is. What's a lot of money to me or you may not be a lot to someone else, etc. But the industry and Square Enix accountants, well, they have very specific ideas of what number they consider to be enough money. And when projections, profit goals, and sales expectations do not meet or exceed that number, they have a bad time.
You're gonna have a bad time.
Stock prices drop, shareholders become unhappy, and very simply, business is bad. And if you're one of the people in charge of a business, you do not want that. You want business to be good.
So where's the part where we have a good time?
I lay all that out to preface this because I want to be very clear that the idea that Final Fantasy is not making enough money is not an opinion or my impression or someone's guess. It's fact. Based on numbers and very specific data, Final Fantasy is not making enough money. Fact. How do we know? Modern installments are failing to exceed or match the sales of their predecessors. Fact. That's not according to me or some internet guy, it's according to Square Enix itself. It's not up for debate, it's not something there can be a discussion about. Per Square Enix, Final Fantasy is not making them enough money. This is not me being a hater, there'll be time for that later, don't worry. It's just numbers. To quote the illustrious Square Enix,
in the HD Games sub-segment, we released multiple titles, including major titles such as Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Part II Rebirth. But profits unfortunately did not meet our expectations. The sub-segment failed to better its profitability, posting operating losses in every year. Ho ho.
Ouch. That doesn't sound good. During a time that saw not one but two releases of the Final Fantasy VII Remake and a mainline series entry, a time that should have seen the franchise bringing in record numbers, sales actually went down and numbers were disappointing across the board. We now live in a time when new Final Fantasy games are looked at skeptically, and when they manage to review at a 7 or above, everyone breathes a collective surprised sigh of relief. Is Final Fantasy in danger of being killed off or anything overly dramatic like that? No, of course not. But its slowly dwindling sales numbers are coming at a time when it's fading from the lofty perch near the top of the RPG gaming cultural zeitgeist that it has enjoyed for years, maybe decades. This next bit is anecdotal, but I'm including it because I think we can all kind of relate. Uptown Bobby, friend, frequent contributor to the channel, and a die-hard Final Fantasy fan for years before I even got into it, bought 16 on launch day, but as of this video, hasn't even started it yet. And when I asked him about it, he said, and I quote, "It couldn't motivate me to engage with it. I had it sitting still wrapped next to my PS5 for over a year, and nothing has inspired me to open it up." Not great.
This isn't good.
I think we all understand at least a little bit of how he feels. Final Fantasy game releases are still a big deal, don't get it twisted, you'd have to be blind to believe otherwise. They're still selling millions of copies, but the bigger problem is that the trends ain't looking too good. And that's what companies go by when making business decisions and projections. Trends, news, mentions, the timeline, etc. In these days of constant 24/7 news and social media, things are far more often measured by how many news cycles they can take up and not simply day one numbers, though the latter remains important too. With that in mind, think about it just for a minute. How quickly do modern Final Fantasy game releases fade from the news cycle these days? Yeah, pretty fast. FF7 Rebirth barely got a few weeks, if that. It took me about a month, 3 weeks or so after it dropped to put out a review, largely because I just wasn't enjoying it, but by that time, people had already moved on. Just a couple weeks. Final Fantasy 16, while a decent game in its own right, virtually disappeared after a week or two. It just dropped on the PC, and we barely heard about it. Outside of series fanatics, it seems like no one really cares about Final Fantasy these days. Longtime fans and industry-owned legacy media will certainly tell you that it's a big deal, but no one really knows why or treats it that way anymore. Final Fantasy is trending down when it should be dominating the gaming, or at least the RPG world, for months after a mainline release, not just a week or so. If you don't believe me, or think that no game enjoys that level of coverage, I encourage you to look at something like Elden Ring. Every gaming site and tons of gaming YouTubers had something about Elden Ring on their front page for months following its release. I couldn't escape it. That is how a Final Fantasy release should ideally be received, or rather, how it used to be. Part of the problem, I think, is the uninspired, overtly linear, regressive gameplay and simplified mechanics of the modern series entries like 16. It's just nothing to talk about. In the past, you could fill pages and pages with endless guides covering potential party lineups, job suggestions, sphere grid plots, character builds, and boss strategies. I know I had tons of them, you guys probably did too. But now, Final Fantasy has practically no emergent gameplay anymore. What are you gonna put in an FF16 guide? Press X a lot to attack the enemies until they die? Remember to heal so you don't die? Walk to the edge of the screen where the quest marker is? Compare that to Elden Ring, a game that offered 10 plus ways to kill every boss that I searched up after having trouble with. And it's not just critical coverage that's disappeared either. Characters like Cloud and Titus positively blanketed media of all types in their day. Everyone knew who those guys were, or at least recognized them. They might not have even played JRPGs, but they recognized those characters. You could show the girl I was dating in 2001 a picture of Titus and she would immediately know who it was. She might also attack you after doing that, but that's a story for another time. Like, how many people do you think know who the hell Clive Rossfield is? Or Prince Noctis Nighttime of the really dark night sleep, Latin edgy darkness. Noctis means of the night. Yeah, we get it. Very creative, guys. Even in the instances when Final Fantasy game sales don't technically disappoint, they still fail to attain the levels of cultural relevance that they used to, and definitely not to the extent that longtime fans expect from the series. Can you honestly say to me that Clive or any FF16 characters even approach the heights of cultural dominance or relevance that classic pillars of the genre like Cloud, Tifa, or Vivi, or Squall did? Maybe the dog? Like, there's even memes about FF12 for God's sake. Other series like Assassin's Creed, Dragon Quest, FromSoft games, they're growing ever larger in their cultural and industry influence, while Final Fantasy seems barely able to hang on to the little it still has, scarcely garnering a news cycle or two when one pops out. It used to be the premier JRPG brand, the franchise that all others looked up to and almost none could even think of touching. Even if the genre wasn't your thing, you knew what Final Fantasy was. Now it barely even qualifies as an RPG to a lot of people, and to many fans of the genre, it's seen as an old, sad joke, often not even meriting a mention in discussion of modern JRPGs. Before we go on, just want to mention that I point all that out just to make the point. I don't personally care how popular it is. If a game is good, well, then it's good. I don't think it should matter to anyone exactly how popular, how much press it gets, as long as it's a good game. The lack of press, the lack of excitement, the lack of news cycle surround it is just a symptom of the problem. So next, we must ask the obvious question. Why? Why is this happening to Final Fantasy? What is going on?
Why?
We'll tackle the most obvious and least susceptible to opinion or subjectivity first. Final Fantasy just has more competition now. It's simple as that. Video games, as an industry, are far larger now than they ever used to be. When Final Fantasy X came out, the market cap was about $10 billion for video games. In 2024, it's over $340 billion. That's insane. It's not incomprehensible. An over 3,000% increase. Video games are now a bigger business than film, sports, and music. It just wouldn't be fair to mention the decline of a franchise as storied as Final Fantasy without also mentioning just how much competition it has now compared to almost none back in its heyday. Anyone with a crappy MacBook from 2016 and a Unity license can, and has, make an RPG easily comparable to any of the old school RPG classics, and in some cases the newer ones as well. So that's an obvious huge point. Can't ignore that. In a world where any given year can see the release of 10 plus JRPGs, it's natural that Final Fantasy isn't going to get quite the same level of media attention it used to. There's simply too much competition. Okay, so that is a fair point. It's not the whole thing, but it is a fair point. Some have posited, even people in Square Enix themselves, that it's just because they released too many Final Fantasy titles too close together. With 16 releasing last June and 7 Remake Part 2 Rebirth dropping just over half a year later, some have said that resulted in, quote, opportunity losses due to cannibalization between our own titles. I'm not a business dude, so can't refute that directly, but I can say it sounds mostly like nonsense to me. Final Fantasy should be, and indeed was, a franchise that people can't get enough of. Whoever said, nah, I've had enough fantastic AAA Final Fantasy games, let's dial that back for a while. Nobody. This isn't the MCU, and Final Fantasy isn't a tedious, unrelated, low-stakes made-for-streaming TV show starring not Iron Man. Nowadays, we're used to mainline series entries dropping every few years, something like that, but let me remind you how they used to drop back in the day. FF7 dropped in 1997. 8, not even 2 years later in 1999. 9 came out just over a year after that in 2000, and 10 barely a year after that in 2001. That's 4 mainline series entries in 4 years, averaging just about a game a year. Now, I point that out not to demand that they release new ones faster, though that would be nice, but merely to dismantle the argument that 16 and 7 cannibalized each other's sales. If customers were able to handle a main series Final Fantasy game every single year back in the 90s, they absolutely would have an appetite for 2 in 8 months, especially after 4 years of nothing and waiting 8 since the last main series entry. And that's not even mentioning how shallow Final Fantasy games tend to be now compared to the sprawling density of those classic series entries. Yet another part of the more competition explanation is the console exclusivity argument. Can't not address that. I've never heard this being an issue for Final Fantasy titles or Square Enix before, so it would be weird if it suddenly became one now, but let's entertain it for a moment anyway. More options for games to play also means more ways to play them, and if you're confining your potential customer base to only those that have a certain platform available to them, then obviously you're limiting it. Of course, on its face, this is true and makes sense. Less potential customers, less sales. But how much of a factor is it really? It's hard to say, but given that Square Enix themselves, in the midst of all this financial disclosure, hasn't mentioned it as a possible explanation, and considering how desperate they likely are for believable excuses currently, makes it difficult for me to believe that console exclusivity really harmed their numbers to a significant extent. And if you add in the fact that companies have market research departments and data scientists for a reason, that reason being to prevent stuff like this from happening, it seems doubly unlikely that they would persist with exclusivity if it were seriously harming sales to the point where they were losing money. Without knowing what kind of deal Square made with Sony, obviously we can't say for sure, but it does stand to reason. To quote from this GameIndustry.biz article, I don't think the numbers add up particularly neatly for the platform exclusivity argument, and while it's not possible to make a robust defensive Square Enix platform strategy without knowing what kind of benefits it negotiated with Sony, which could well have made it into absolutely the right choice commercially, it's at least fair to say that it's not obvious that this was a strategic error. The available data just does not provide easy support for platform exclusivity as the villain. Okay, that pretty well puts that entire theory to bed as far as I'm concerned, so let's move on and ask the real question. How did all this happen? When did it happen? How did Final Fantasy tumble so rapidly and completely from grace?
Why?
This GameIndustry.biz article posits, and I agree, that the problem really started when Square Enix began viewing Final Fantasy as its mainstream pillar franchise, despite it never having been intended as such for the majority of its previous existence. I will quote from that article because I think this dude says it just about as well as I ever could.
Tell him about the Twinkie.
For a real understanding of what happened, you have to look to the management of the Final Fantasy brand overall in recent decades. Its problems all arguably trace back to Square Enix's own deeply held belief that this game is its mainstream pillar franchise, which means that a major Final Fantasy game has to be everything to everyone, a gigantic, mainstream hit on the level of a Call of Duty or even a GTA game. But that ignores the reality of what Final Fantasy has been throughout its history. It was at the vanguard of JRPGs, yes, but the moments when that genre and Final Fantasy itself brushed up against mainstream success and acceptance were the exception, not the rule. It's a niche genre, one which benefits from having an insanely devoted fanbase and thus lots of merchandise sales and opportunities for ancillary revenue, but overtly chasing mainstream success requires taking major steps away from what makes that genre appealing to its core fans in the first place. Yeah, and there we have it. Now we come to the real problem. What the hell even is Final Fantasy at this point? If myself and many of you, longtime fans of the series for in some cases going on 30 years, don't have the answer to that question, you can bet no one else does either. And for Final Fantasy and Square Enix both, that is very bad news. Some of you may recall that when we last asked this question back in my Final Fantasy 16 review, I explained that Final Fantasy is whatever Square Enix says it is. I also pointed out that it may be helpful to think of the question, what is a Final Fantasy game, kind of like the Ship of Theseus thought experiment. And if you're not familiar, the Ship of Theseus essentially asks the question, is a ship still the same ship even if every part of it has been removed and replaced with something different? Final Fantasy is very much like that. If every part of what you identified, enjoyed, or valued in a Final Fantasy game was removed and replaced with something else, would you still call it a Final Fantasy game? If you took someone who was completely unfamiliar with the franchise, who had just played through Final Fantasy VII and then handed them FF16, they'd probably look at you like, what in the hell is this? Would they still then keep buying those games just because they said Final Fantasy on the box? Now, back in that video, I said no, but Square Enix, naturally, said yes. And that's because when you get right down to it, their answer is not only correct, but it's also the only real one. Final Fantasy is whatever Square Enix says it is, and sadly, that's all it is anymore. The only thing modern Final Fantasy games have in common, aside from shallow window dressing with words like Phoenix Down or Moogle, is that they're all called Final Fantasy. And Square Enix's answer about what Final Fantasy is, it hasn't changed since then, and that answer, or rather the fact that they don't really have a serious one, has finally caught up with them and started costing them money. Which, not really surprisingly, is why we're now actually seeing it being addressed, not only by Square Enix themselves, but also by gaming journalists. Imagine that. I find that funny for two reasons. One, because I like when corpos have problems, and two, because that means I once again get to say, I told you so. And it's not funny for one reason, and that's that we all love Final Fantasy and hate that it kind of sucks now. In all my FF7 remake videos and all the rant videos, my Crisis Core review, and my Final Fantasy 16 review, I said this was going to be a problem for them eventually, if it wasn't already. I said they've been mismanaging this brand and that it was only a matter of time before they were forced to address it, because I knew then, as I know now, as likely many of you also know, that you can't leave the identity of a franchise without a lane to thrive in, and you especially can't do that with a brand as old and celebrated as Final Fantasy, a tentpole for the company and a pillar of the RPG industry. Now, if you erode its identity with what are ultimately self-destructive business practices like endless trend chasing and design by committee and spreadsheet, well, you end up with an IP that is utterly unable to differentiate itself in a market that is becoming increasingly oversaturated. This isn't the 90s or even the early 2000s when a truly good JRPG would come around, I don't know, once every few years or so if we were lucky. These days we get, at minimum, 3 or more a year, and that's not even counting indies, which often turn out to be better than their more costly competitors anyway. I'm afraid these days it's gonna take a lot more or something a lot different than a brooding basic bitch male action hero stereotype and some flashy boss battles to get it done. Ask yourself right now, what does the name Final Fantasy mean? When you hear Final Fantasy, what do you think of? Chocobos, a Moogle, the words Phoenix down, a gloved hand cursor, and blue menus? If you have an answer, which many probably don't, I'm willing to bet that for most of you, that answer is, well, it's an RPG. Except it's not, anymore, by Square Enix's own doing. And even if it could technically be labeled as such in some instances, and I know some people still try to do that, it certainly doesn't feel like one anymore, at least not to people for whom that aspect of it was the primary appeal, which is most of us. And if it's not an RPG, what the hell is it? Tragically, to most that aren't already fans of the series, it's just another action game in an already endless sea of third-person action games that are barely distinguishable from each other as it is, each one fighting the unwinnable battle of trying to be the prettiest or the flashiest or the most graphically impressive game of the year. In an era when improved cutting-edge graphics meant the jump from Final Fantasy 6 to 7, or from 7 to 10, maybe that was a good contest to engage in. But now, when most customers, or developers for that matter, can't even differentiate between a PS4 game and a PS5 game, that doesn't exactly strike me as a smart move. Just ask Nintendo and their console using hardware from a decade ago that still managed to outsell everyone else. The bottom line here, G's, is that the story of modern Final Fantasy is that of a series that doesn't have a core audience anymore. Or if it does, Square is conducting themselves and the franchise like they don't know who it is. Or don't care, I'm not sure which is worse. It's the old adage, when you try to please everyone, you end up pleasing no one, and Square should really reassess whether the audience Final Fantasy actually has justifies the amount that they keep spending on it. And what's even funnier about all this is that as Square Enix continue to further distance Final Fantasy from its JRPG roots and fans, in desperate pursuit of some nebulous goal that will presumably magically make it appeal to both hardcore fans and somehow also everyone else, the JRPG genre is larger than ever before and it's getting even bigger. This is what you wanted, isn't it, guys? Final Fantasy, a JRPG as your flagship brand? Well, you got it. Why are you trying so hard to distance yourself from it now? They're so far from where they started that they can't even see that there's more money where they came from than where they're going. Why are they seemingly running away from money? For an excellent example of this, we need look no further than the Dragon Quest series. The actual mainline series entries, not the countless spin-offs, obviously. Dragon Quest XI. For instance, in fairness, perhaps this isn't exactly a one-to-one comparison as it's been out for longer than Final Fantasy 16 and on more platforms, but as of right now, it's sold over 6 million copies on barely a $20 million budget, while Final Fantasy 16, on the other hand, has only managed to sell just under 5 million despite costing well over 60 million to develop. Historically, Final Fantasy does tend to sell more than Dragon Quest typically, but I bring these numbers up to illustrate two things. Number one, that it is by no means necessary to spend as much on Final Fantasy games as Square Enix seems to think. Dragon Quest is still and always has been a turn-based JRPG. If Final Fantasy was likewise scaled back to just that and sold only as much as the most recent Dragon Quest installment, it would not only be a huge success, but profitable as well, just like Dragon Quest XI. And number two, maybe more importantly, traditional turn-based RPGs are by no means an unpopular genre. In fact, by many metrics, they're even more popular now than they ever have been. Seems like an odd time to decide to abandon all the trappings of a genre that's not only on the rise, but also one that your company happens to be an expert in. I don't really get it. If you, like me, played Final Fantasy games because you love JRPGs and that's no longer what it is, how long are people going to wait around for it to go back to that until they just start playing something else? See, people who buy Dragon Quest games know exactly what they're getting every time. They're JRPG fans and they play Dragon Quest because it currently is and always has been a JRPG. Its fan base isn't going anywhere. It's getting bigger and game sales overall have been showing an upward positive trend for several years now. Its identity isn't in question and never has been. Do you think that would be the case if Dragon Quest XI had instead been a surprise action game? What if the next God of War was an RTS? What if the next Call of Duty turns out to be a fantasy MMO? How well would Assassin's Creed do if it suddenly was turned into a card game? Would people still buy them? At first, of course, sure, some people would, but would anyone be surprised if the sales and popularity of those franchises started steeply declining after that? Moreover, how many would be celebrating those changes, do you think? Small pockets of customers, of course, there's always a few wackos, but By and large, longtime fans would be left feeling confused, abandoned, and eventually would start moving on, seeking elsewhere what they used to get from those franchises, which, incidentally, is exactly where we are with Final Fantasy right now. Go figure. So, what the hell does Square Enix do? They've got a franchise that their greed and hubris allowed to balloon from a hardcore, fan-favorite niche audience product into some deranged Frankenstein disaster beyond the ability of most customers to even identify. Its core fanbase has been almost completely abandoned and left behind, and now, bizarrely, it finds itself required to function as a company tentpole and to compete with the biggest blockbuster mass appeal game titles in the world, like GTA and Call of Duty. Do they simply reverse course, bring Final Fantasy back to its roots as a turn-based JRPG and just say F it? Do they press on with their current direction, haphazardly throwing whatever the current gaming gimmicks are at it and chasing trends wherever they lead, making games based only on what they think will sell and compete with other blockbuster mega franchises, just slap the name Final Fantasy on whatever results from that? The brand and name alone are worth far too much for them to ever consider sunsetting it completely, but their current circumstances and the industry reaction to them suggest that they'll likely change something. That's how business works, after all. A problem is identified, correctly or not, as recent news stories clearly indicate has happened, and then changes are implemented in response. What will those changes be? Exactly how idiotic and customer blind will they go? Does the Final Fantasy that fans have loved for almost 30 years stand a chance of returning? We'll just have to wait and find out, geez, but I trust y'all can probably guess how I think it'll go.
Well, the world's a twisted place.
Whew, alright, that's our show. That was quite an intense video. Hope y'all had fun. Thank you so much for chilling with us tonight and spending this little bit of your free time here. We love you today. We love you all the way. What do y'all think about this? Do you agree that Final Fantasy has a problem, or do you think it's better now than it ever has been? Do you even play RPGs? Should Final Fantasy even still be an RPG at all? Do you think it sucks and not care? Do you hate me because I talk about stuff that makes you sad? Let us know in the comments down below, and we will see everyone next week when we'll inevitably engage in much more salacious sarcasm and sophomore shenanigans.
Woke up, smoke up, blunt, then I pass out. Pass out. Woke up, what up, smoke up, blunt, then I'm back down. Back down. What? Yup, woke up, smoke up, blunt, then I pass out. Pass out. Woke up, what up, smoke up, blunt, then I'm